Hey, sixth graders, Mr. Tracy here. We're going to talk about story plot terms. And for some of us, these are going to be new terms. And I know some of your fifth grade teachers introduced these terms to you maybe to get a little bit of a head start on how we're going to talk about fiction stories, fiction books this year, and some of the terms that we're going to use. So these are the terms that we'll use throughout the year: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So you do need to know these terms. We're going to have a quiz over them. So this video is going to kind of help you get to know these terms. Before we get to those, though, let's talk about some words that are going to be a review for you that maybe you learned when you were in kindergarten and first grade. So we have characters, conflict, and setting. We need to be able to discuss those words as we're working through those story plot terms. Two new ones for you might be protagonist and antagonist. So we're going to start with those. Then we'll review characters, conflict, and setting, and then we'll get into those terms for our story plot. So here we go. The first thing, protagonist. It's really just a fancy name for the main character.
Hiding any shocking and fantastic abilities they'd like to disclose. I'm open to suggestions.
So there's Tony Stark there, and he's an example of a protagonist. We're rooting for him maybe to make the right decision to save the day at the end of the book or the end of the movie. Harry Potter's another famous protagonist, as is Luke Skywalker. Favorite show this last summer when I was watching Gravity Falls. In this case, there really isn't a specific one protagonist. The brother and sister, they really work together. They're kind of a combined protagonist. So really, they're both working together. So it's kind of a combined protagonist. Doesn't have to be a person. Could be an animal, like Winnie the Pooh would be a protagonist in those stories. Now let's talk antagonist. So an antagonist is antagonizing the protagonist. So it's the force that's working against the main character.
I am your father.
Most often it's another character, but it doesn't have to be. The antagonist can be an idea. It could be a character that's maybe afraid of something, and that's really what's working against the character. So it could be kind of the character himself or herself that's working against their own kind of interest. It could be a weather sort of issue. So in the Jurassic Park or Jurassic World, we have dinosaurs. Another famous kind of antagonist would be the Joker. Could be a volcano. This is a great antagonist for me in my favorite movie, The Princess Bride, the man with 6 fingers on his hand. Characters. So our definition in middle school is going to be any person, figure, or animal that takes part in the action of the story. So that's our definition for characters. Our definition for setting is the time and place. So it's really the when, the time, and the where, the place. So he's checking his watch here, looking to see what time it is, but also you can see he's in a field. So there's 2 things for setting, time, and place. Our definition for conflict is going to be the word struggle. Our conflict is our struggle that the character is facing. In elementary school, sometimes your teacher maybe used the word problem. We're really going to use the word struggle. And there's a little bit of a conflict going on in that picture there. Let's go ahead now and take a look at the story plot. This diagram looks a little bit different than the one I had on that first page, but this is a good place for you to kind of pause and read over these if you're going to study them right here on the screen. But we have the exposition. You can see it explains that a little bit. Then it moves to the second part of the story, which is the rising action. Then we get to the climax, which is our high point there at the top of this mountain. And then we start to come down. We have the falling action. And then lastly, the resolution. I'm not going to read over those kind of things underneath each. You can do that. That's a good thing for you to pause the video, do that on your own, come back and study it. I actually have this as the last slide too that you can kind of review at the end. But let's take a kind of a closer look at each of these parts. So we have the exposition. The exposition is at the very beginning. We see our hiker guy there, right there at the beginning. And it says this usually occurs at the beginning of a short story. So at a short story, even your chapter book, it's the exposition. The characters are introduced. We find out, okay, who's taking place or part in the action. We learn about the setting. And most importantly, the author gives us information about what that main conflict. We have an idea of what the big kind of issue, problem, struggle is going to be for that character, usually in the first couple paragraphs of a short story, usually by the end of the first or second chapter of a chapter book. So that's our exposition, the beginning, the setting, the characters, and the conflict. Those are the main parts of our exposition. Once we get there, now we move into the rising action. The book starts to get more exciting, or the story, the tension starts to build. It says this part of the story begins to develop the conflict or conflicts. There's a building of interest or suspense. With this part, it might not be a steady climb. You can see in that red box there, it kind of goes up and down. So it isn't always a straight shot up to that peak of the mountain. We could kind of have some ups and downs. Some stories, some books are going to have more suspense. They're going to have more kind of building up. It really just depends on the type of story that the author is trying to tell us. But we do have our main character. Our main character is working on solving his or her conflict. So that's where we get that building up of suspense. Maybe they have some roadblocks in their way, there's some setbacks. That's the rising action. What are we waiting to find out, though? We're waiting for that climax, that big moment. Sometimes we call this the turning point in the story. What's the most exciting thing? What are we looking forward to finding out? That's the climax. That's at the very peak. This is the turning point of the story. Usually the main character comes face to face with a conflict. In that example with the pictures, I had Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. They're going to meet and they're maybe going to have a battle of some kind. Harry Potter is going to face off against Voldemort at that big moment of the climax. Doesn't have to be a fight. There doesn't have to be a sword fight. Doesn't always have to be punching involved. But we have that moment that we're waiting for. That's the climax of our story. Once we have the climax, we have an easing of tension, and that's the falling action. When you're reading a book, if you're getting close to that climax, you might find that you don't want to take a break. You might be leaning forward into the book. If you're at a movie for the climax, you might be leaning forward in your seat, but all of a sudden you get this release of tension at the falling action. You sit back in your chair because you've got that climax out of the way. Now for falling action, loose ends of the plot are being tied up. The conflict and the climax are taken care of, and the author is on his or her way to kind of finishing up that book or that story. That brings us to the last thing, which is resolution. If you notice, it looks a lot like the word solution. We get to the solution often at the end of an experiment in science. We come up with a solution to our problem at the end. That's how I always remember that resolution comes at the end. But this is where our story comes to a reasonable ending. The author wraps it up, sometimes with a nice, neat bow. Everything's taken care of. The bad guy goes off to jail. The city is safe again. Or the two people in Mrs. Tracy type of favorite story would be, They live happily ever after. So that's our resolution. Sometimes a resolution, though, an author might kind of have some things left undone for us to kind of think about. Still the resolution, they might sometimes even throw in a cliffhanger for us, but it is still the end of the story. It comes to a reasonable ending. So hopefully you can review these terms. You have access to these slides without Mr. Tracy's voice. You have this where you can kind of go over this. You can pause it in the video, but this explains these different parts of our plot. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully this was either a good review for you or an opportunity for you to learn about these new terms.